Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into the remarkable world of the bighorn sheep. Just picture them. These majestic creatures of the mountains, instantly recognizable, by those incredible curling horns, and famous for their epic head-butting clashes. But what if the very thing that makes them so iconic also holds a dark secret? And how have these symbols of the wild faced down immense pressures, really pushing them to the brink sometimes? We're about to uncover these surprising complexities, from their ingenious mating rituals to the hidden threats that challenge their very survival. We've got a stack of sources today: scientific papers, conservation reports, even a curious online discussion to unpack these insights for you.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how these diverse sources let us connect the dots. We can see the intricate details about individual animal behavior and link them to the broader ecological and conservation challenges facing the entire species. Our mission today really is to give you a truly thorough understanding of these remarkable animals and also the immense, really complex efforts underway to protect them.
Okay, let's unpack this. When you think
Yeah,
of a bighorn ram, it's impossible not to think of those incredible spiraling horns, right?
absolutely.
They're so central to their lives, especially, when it comes to mating.
Definitely.
But here's something genuinely surprising, I think. Their mating strategies go far beyond just brute force. They show this really ingenious level of, like, tactical thinking.
That's right.
What are some of these remarkable methods the males use?
Well, according to the mating and bighorn sheep research we looked at, male rams employ multiple truly creative strategies to secure breeding opportunities. The main one is called tending. That's where a ram basically defends a single estrus ewe, monopolizing her attention.
Okay, guarding her. Makes sense.
Exactly. But then there are more active dynamic methods. There's coursing.
Coursing?
Yeah, coursing involves rams directly fighting other tending rams, maybe just for temporary access to a defended ewe. It's more opportunistic,
Ah, okay. A quick strike?
kind of. And then there's blocking. This is where rams actively move and hold ewes away from other competing rams. They might push them beyond the periphery of a traditional tending area. This really shows their ability to actively create mating opportunities, not just, wait for them.
Wow, that's incredible, that level of strategic complexity. But you hinted earlier at something darker about these magnificent horns. What exactly is this startling and quite grim fact our sources revealed?
Indeed. One source graphically illustrates a really tragic dark side to horn growth. There are cases where a ram's horn just kept growing until it actually penetrated its own skull.
Into the skull.
Yeah,
Seriously.
seriously, imagine that, sometimes right under the eye. The progression is slow, it's painful, it slowly impacts jaw movement, making it impossible for the animal to eat properly, and ultimately, in some documented cases, penetrating the brain itself.
Under the eye. That's a truly grim picture. A stark reminder that even in nature's design, there can be these unexpected tragic flaws. It's such a profound paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does a feature so clearly designed for survival, for fighting, for procreation, how does it turn into a self-inflicted wound like that?
Well, it raises a really important question about the mechanisms of evolution and natural selection. Normally, you'd expect biology to select against and remove such, self-killing traits from the gene pool.
Right.
But if this condition manifests later in the ram's life, maybe after it has already had the chance to reproduce and pass on its genes,
Hi.
then it might have already passed on those, quote, bad horn genes to its offspring. So selection doesn't catch it in time, so to speak.
Okay, so timing matters.
It does. Or it could simply be caused by an injury to the growing horn cells themselves, disrupting their normal growth pattern. That can happen too. And it's also important to remember, bighorn rams have these incredible double-layered skulls. They're shored up with bone struts and a massive tendon specifically for absorbing the impacts from ramming each other. Huge forces involved there.
Yeah, those headbutts are legendary.
Exactly. But this slow internal penetration from their own horn, that's a completely different kind of challenge. That natural protection is, well, it's ineffective against that. Interestingly, similar issues like teeth growing abnormally into the skull have been seen in other animals too, things like rabbits, even domestic cows sometimes.
Nature is complicated. Okay, so moving from the individual animal to the population level,
Right.
the story of bighorn sheep is also one of significant decline, isn't it? At times,
Yeah.
really drastic decline. They're such an iconic North American species, embodying that wild spirit of the mountains. But they faced immense pressures. What drove that decline?
Yeah, they're endemic to North America, meaning they evolved here and are found only on this continent. And their populations did experience massive declines, starting way back in the late 1800s. Things like early human settlement, unregulated hunting, widespread habitat loss, they all contributed.
The usual suspects, sadly.
Pretty much. But our sources point to what they call the most onerous factor, and that was the introduction of domestic livestock, particularly domestic sheep. This exposed native bighorn populations to entirely new bacterial pathogens, things they had absolutely no immunity against.
Ah, the disease angle again. How bad was the population crash, and what was the real impact of these diseases?
Historical estimates vary quite a bit, as you can imagine. There's a popular estimate of maybe 1.5 million bighorns back in 1850. A more likely figure might be around 500,000, 500,000.
Okay.
But either way, their numbers plummeted, down to less than 10% of those historical figures.
Less than 10%. That's staggering.
It really is. Today, there are only about 81,000 bighorn sheep across all of North America. That's roughly 12,000 in Canada, maybe 12,000 in Mexico, and around 57,000 or so in the United States. And respiratory diseases, largely triggered by that contact, direct or indirect with domestic sheep, were the primary driver of these devastating widespread die-offs.
That's just a massive collapse, less than 10%.
Yeah.
Given that drastic drop, how immediate was the need for conservation action? Did that urgency affect the early strategies?
Oh, absolutely. The need was critical. Faced with such a drastic situation, conservationists had to act.
So what specific steps have they taken? How do you try and bring a species back from that kind of brink?
Well, the primary tool used for decades now has been translocation.
Moving animal.
Exactly. It involves carefully capturing animals from existing healthy wild populations and then moving them to reestablish populations in their historical habitats where they'd vanished, or sometimes to augment declining herds that are just struggling. Millions and millions of US dollars and just immense effort from state and federal agencies, plus many public and private organizations, have been poured into these restoration programs over the years.
Okay, so translocation is key. But beyond just, picking up sheep and moving them somewhere else, what makes for a successful restoration project? What are the critical elements?
Habitat considerations are absolutely crucial. You can't just put them anywhere. Bighorn sheep rely on steep, rugged terrain. That's their main defense for predator evasion, giving them critical escape routes.
Right, makes sense.
The availability of surface water is also critically important, especially in those arid desert ecosystems where they might not get enough water just from the plants they eat.
Okay, terrain, water, what else?
And then there's vegetation management. This can include techniques like prescribed fire, carefully managed burns. This can enhance the quality of the forage, the plants they eat, and also improve visibility, making it easier for them to spot predators. Although policies in protected wilderness areas can sometimes complicate these efforts, as fire management might be restricted there.
Right, management can be complex in protected zones. That all sounds like very careful planning. But if we move animals around, what about that disease risk you mentioned earlier, especially the one from domestic sheep? Does that complicate these translocations?
Oh, hugely. It's a major, major challenge. Bighorn sheep are highly vulnerable to diseases like Mycoplasma ovypneumonia. It's a particular... Yeah. And there are other bacteria often involved too, causing similar respiratory issues like Pastorella multisata and Mannheimia hemolytica.
These come from domestic sheep.
Primarily, yes. They are commonly carried by domestic sheep, often without causing them serious illness, but they can be devastating to bighorns. The restoration of bighorn sheep source we looked at specifically highlights that proximity to domestic sheep is a key limiting factor for these translocation efforts. You might have an area that looks perfect, geologically great terrain, water, but it might be excluded from consideration specifically because of the risk of pathogen transmission from nearby domestic flocks.
Wow. So domestic sheep basically create no-go zones for bighorn restoration.
In many cases, yes. And when bighorn sheep first encounter a novel strain of this M. ovypneumonia, well, all-age die-offs are very common. It can wipe out huge portions of a herd, adults and lambs alike.
Devastating.
And even if some adults survive and maybe gain some strain-specific immunity, juvenile mortality lamb survival often remains incredibly high for years afterward. This profoundly suppresses population growth, making recovery really slow. It can even affect things like sexually selected traits like the length of a ram's horns, because the animals are just generally less healthy.
So even with millions spent on moving them, it sounds like domestic sheep remain this persistent, almost intractable challenge, especially for translocation. Are there debates within conservation circles about how best to mitigate that risk? It seems so fundamental.
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant discussion and a source of, well, difficult decisions. Managing that interface between wild and domestic sheep is probably one of the biggest challenges in bighorn conservation.
And speaking of long-term health and resilience, what role does genetic diversity play in all this?
Genetic diversity is absolutely vital, crucial for population health and their ability to adapt. Translocations, especially if you start a new population with just a small group of animals, can lead to what biologists call founder effects and genetic bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks, meaning reduced diversity.
Exactly. It results in new populations having very low genetic diversity, which makes them inherently less resilient, less able to cope with challenges like disease or environmental change. Studies show a really strong link between higher genetic diversity and better overall fitness. That includes lower susceptibility to mycoplasma pneumonia, for example, and stronger immune responses generally.
So more diversity equals healthier sheep. Makes sense.
Generally, yes. But it's not always simple. There's also a concern called outbreeding depression.
Outbreeding depression, what's that?
That's where mixing individuals from genetically distinct populations, maybe populations adapted to very different environments, can actually disrupt those local adaptations. It can sometimes reduce fitness in the offspring.
Huh. So you can't just mix any sheep with any other sheep and expect good results.
Not necessarily. It makes managing genetics really complex. You have to balance the need for diversity with the risk of disrupting helpful local adaptations. It requires very careful planning and often genetic analysis.
Wow. Okay, so beyond disease and these tricky genetic issues, are there other significant natural pressures bighorn sheep face? What about predators?
Predation is definitely a significant factor, of course. Mountain lions are major predators, along with coyotes, bobcats, and even golden eagles can take lambs. Mountain lion predation in particular can really impede restoration efforts, especially when you're dealing with newly established or smaller, more vulnerable populations.
Right, a few losses can hit a small population hard.
Exactly. And this also involves a phenomenon, an ecological interaction called apparent competition.
Apparent competition.
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive. Bighorn sheep can be negatively affected if a predator they share with another species, like mountain lions hunting both bighorns and mule deer. If that predator primarily preys on the more numerous species, say mule deer, but then switches to preying more heavily on bighorns when the mule deer population happens to decline.
Ah, so the bighorns suffer because of changes in the other prey species population.
Precisely. Even if the bighorn numbers haven't changed, the predation pressure on them increases because the predator shifts its focus. It's a complex ecological dynamic that definitely impacts their survival.
Man, it sounds like they face challenges from all sides: disease, genetics, predators, habitat. So given all these complexities, what does this all mean for the future of bighorn sheep conservation? How are these intensive efforts funded? And what are the ongoing debates?
Well, interestingly, bighorn sheep are actually among the most conservatively managed hunted species in North America.
Conservatively managed, meaning
Meaning hunting opportunities are very limited, highly regulated, and often very expensive. And millions of dollars for their restoration are raised annually specifically through the sale of special hunting permits. This often happens through cooperative efforts between state or provincial wildlife agencies and various private conservation organizations like the Wild Sheep Foundation.
so $100 are directly funding conservation.
A significant portion, yes. It's a major funding mechanism. And in Mexico, there's been success with a slightly different model where private landowners have been very successful in reestablishing populations, often with financial incentives derived directly from permit sales on their land. It shows different ways conservation can be funded.
That's fascinating. So looking ahead, what are the big picture challenges? Where is bighorn conservation headed, especially with, climate change and increasing human pressures?
That's the big question. The future use of translocation, while it's been so vital, might become more limited, precisely because of that inherent risk of spreading diseases between populations.
Right, moving animals means moving potential risks too.
Exactly. So some managers are considering a shift, perhaps moving away from relying primarily on capturing excess individuals from successful populations just for translocation stock. Instead, the thinking might move towards managing populations more holistically, where maybe both male and female bighorn sheep could be subject to some level of hunter-harvest as part of broader management strategies.
A different approach to population control and funding.
Potentially. Aiming for a more sustainable, perhaps self-regulating approach within established populations rather than constant relocation. And there are definitely ongoing debates about the appropriateness of mixing bighorn sheep from different evolutionary lineages, those genetic concerns we talked about. How best do you manage genetic diversity while minimizing disease transmission risk, especially considering the challenges posed by increasing human populations encroaching on their habitat and growing environmental demands? It's a constant balancing act.
It really is. Well, we've navigated the remarkable world of bighorn sheep today, from their elaborate, sometimes surprising mating strategies and that really unexpected danger of their own magnificent horns,
Hmm.
all the way to the intensive, multifaceted, and frankly, very challenging efforts to restore their populations. It's a truly captivating story, I think, of resilience, scientific innovation, and that delicate balance required for effective conservation.
Absolutely. And if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, the bighorn sheep's story really serves as a powerful example, doesn't it? It shows just how interconnected wildlife health is with everything else: habitat, human activity, even the tiniest genetic details within a population. It profoundly underscores the constant vigilance, the need for solid science, and the adaptability required in modern conservation efforts. It's never static.
So perhaps the provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider is this. In a world where even an animal's most defining characteristic, like those horns, can paradoxically become its undoing, and where human intervention is simultaneously a source of past problems and a key to future solutions, what other unseen connections and unexpected vulnerabilities might exist in the natural world all around us, just waiting for our next deep dive?